Story 1. The Thing at Black. The Thing at Black Pine Sighting. Location: Allegheny National Forest, Pennsylvania. Approximate year: 2012. I still do not know what we saw at Black Pine Sighting. I know what the Army wrote in the report. I know what my lieutenant told us to say afterward. And I know what the men from the receiving unit told us when they finally arrived that night. Those three things are not the same. This happened in the fall of 2012 when I was 23 years old and serving with an Army logistics unit in Pennsylvania. Our job was not glamorous. We moved equipment, ammunition, spare parts, field gear, and whatever else needed to be transferred from one place to another. Most days were paperwork, loading manifests, vehicle checks, inventory numbers, and standing around while someone higher up decided that yesterday's plan was no longer the plan. The assignment that changed the way I look at the woods sounded simple at first. A restricted training site in the Allegheny region needed a shipment of weapons and sealed ammunition crates moved by rail. The place was buried deep in state and federal forest land, connected to the outside world by an old freight spur that was rarely used anymore. I had never been there. Most of us had not. We were told only what we needed to know. The shipment was sensitive. The route was approved, and a receiving team would meet us at a remote siding before midnight. There were 7 freight cars in the movement, plus 3 small escort cars where the security teams rode. The arrangement was simple. The locomotive went first. Behind it was the first escort car with 4 soldiers and 1 officer, then 4 freight cars, then the second escort car, where I was assigned, then 3 more freight cars. At the very end was the third escort car. Each escort team had 4 enlisted soldiers and 1 officer. We carried standard weapons, radios, flashlights, and enough bad coffee to keep everyone irritated for the entire ride. I remember joking that if anything went wrong, it would be mechanical, not tactical. I was wrong. We left in the morning and spent most of the day rattling through small towns, industrial yards, and long stretches of forest. By sunset, the windows had gone black except for the occasional glow of a farmhouse or a crossing signal. After that, there was nothing. No towns, no highway lights, no cell service, just dark hills pressing against both sides of the track. Sometime close to midnight, the train slowed. Then it stopped. One of the radios crackled. "Black Pine Siding, hold position." That was all. No receiving team, no vehicles, no floodlights, nothing. The siding was a narrow strip of gravel beside a single track, surrounded by dense forest. Tall black pines stood so close together that our flashlights barely cut 10 yards between them. Beyond the tree line, the woods looked solid, the kind of dark that seems to have weight. Our lieutenant, Barnes, stepped down from the middle escort car and told us to check the seals on the freight cars nearest us. The other teams did the same. Nobody was nervous at first. Annoyed? Yes. Cold? Yes. But not afraid? This was the Army. People were late. Plans changed. Someone forgot to call someone else. That was normal. We spread out along the train. 1 man stayed by each escort car. The rest of us walked the length of our assigned freight cars, checking locks, seals, and the numbers painted on the sides. The air smelled like wet pine needles, old creosote, and diesel exhaust. Somewhere far off, an owl called once. Then everything went quiet. I had just finished checking the second car when a scream came from the rear of the train. Not a shout, a scream. 5 seconds later, there was a gunshot. Everyone moved at once. Barnes yelled for one soldier to stay with our car, then the rest of us ran toward the rear escort team. Boots hit gravel. Rifles came up. Someone shouted, "Contact rear." When we reached the last escort car, Lieutenant Mercer from the rear team was standing beside the steps with his pistol in both hands. His face had gone white. The 4 soldiers assigned to him were no longer outside. They had climbed back into their escort car and were staring through the windows. Barnes grabbed Mercer by the shoulder. "What happened?" Mercer did not answer at first. He just pointed toward the tree line. His hand was shaking. "There," he said. "There's somebody out there." Barnes turned toward the woods. "Identify yourself." No answer. The first escort team came running up from the front of the train. Within a minute, nearly all of us were gathered near the rear car, staring into the darkness beyond the gravel. We had several regular flashlights, but they were useless against that forest. Someone went back to the middle escort car and brought out the big, rechargeable spotlight we used for night inspections. Barnes took it, switched it on, and swept the beam across the trees. At first, we saw nothing. Just trunks, branches, ferns, wet leaves. Then something moved. Not far into the woods, maybe 80 or 90 yards from the track. The spotlight snapped back, and there it was, half hidden behind a pine tree. At first, my mind tried to make it into a man. That is what your brain does when it sees something standing upright. It searches for a familiar shape, a hunter, a homeless guy, a local trying to mess with soldiers. But it was not right. It was about the height of an average man, maybe a little taller. 6 feet, give or take. It had shoulders, it had arms, it had a head. But the entire visible side of its body was covered in dark hair. Not clothing, hair. Long, matted, dirty hair that hung from its arms and chest in uneven strips. It was standing mostly behind the tree, with only half its body visible, as if it knew exactly how much of itself it wanted us to see. The strangest part was the way it looked at us. It was not startled. It was not running. It seemed curious, like we were the strange things. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the low idle of the locomotive, and beneath it, a dry scraping noise. At first, I could not place it. Then I saw the creature's hand. It was dragging its fingers slowly down the bark of the pine tree. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound carried through the cold air with horrible clarity. Those fingers were too long. Or maybe they were claws. I cannot honestly say. Mercer raised his pistol again. Barnes pushed his arm down. "Don't shoot unless it comes at us." Then he shouted into the woods, "Move away from the track!" The thing did not move. It kept staring. The spotlight shook slightly in Barnes's hand. I remember that clearly because Barnes was not the type of man who shook easily. One of the soldiers behind me whispered, "Is that a bear?" Nobody answered him, because everyone knew it was not a bear. A bear does not stand behind a tree like a man hiding from porch light. A bear does not watch you like that. Mercer shouted something I could not understand. His voice cracked halfway through. That was when Barnes fired one round into the air. The gunshot rolled through the trees and came back from the hills in broken echoes. The creature reacted instantly. It did not flinch like an animal. It simply pulled itself behind the pine. 1 second it was there. The next second, there was only bark and darkness. We kept the spotlight on that tree for a long time. Nothing came out from either side. Then headlights appeared down the service road beyond the siding. 2 military trucks came crawling through the dark with their lights dimmed. Behind them was a flatbed and a covered utility vehicle. The receiving team had finally arrived. They were not surprised to find us armed and clustered near the rear of the train. That was the first thing that bothered me. They looked tense but not confused. A master sergeant climbed out of the lead truck and walked straight to Barnes. "Any problems?" Barnes pointed toward the trees. "We had movement. Rear team saw something. Humanoid, maybe 6 feet, covered in hair." The master sergeant looked toward the woods. Then he sighed. Not laughed, not frowned, sighed, like Barnes had just told him that the old generator was acting up again. "You saw it by the tree line?" Mercer stepped forward. "I fired at it." "You hit it?" "No, warning shot." The master sergeant looked relieved. "Good." Barnes stared at him. "What do you mean, good?" The man took a moment before answering. "We see them around here sometimes." Nobody said anything. Them. That was the word he used. Not it. Them. One of our sergeants said, "You mean people?" The master sergeant shook his head. "I mean them?" He would not give us a name. Not at first. He just told us they had been seen near the siding before, usually at night, usually watching from the trees, sometimes one, sometimes more. "They don't usually come close when we're armed," he said, "but they watch. You feel it before you see them." One of the men from his team added, "This one's the curious one." The curious one. I still hate that phrase. They started unloading the freight cars quickly. Nobody wasted time. Nobody wandered far from the trucks. Every few minutes, one of the receiving soldiers would turn and sweep a flashlight across the tree line. I asked one of them what those things did. He looked at me for a long second before answering. "They don't bother us much." "Much?" He glanced toward the forest. "We find animals sometimes, rabbits, deer, coyotes." "What do you mean?" "Find them." "Torn up." He said it quietly, then walked away before I could ask anything else. For the next hour, we helped transfer the sealed crates and checked off numbers under portable lights. Everything felt wrong. Too quiet. Too watched. The woods beyond the siding seemed alive in a way I had never felt before. Not with movement. With attention. You know how a crowded room feels different when everyone suddenly turns to look at you? That was the forest. A wall of trees, all staring. When the last crate was loaded, the receiving team signed the paperwork. Barnes and the officers exchanged a few short words. Nobody mentioned the creature again out loud. The master sergeant only gave us one instruction. Stay in your cars until you're clear of the forest. Barnes did not argue. We moved back along the train, checking that each escort team was inside and accounted for. The locomotive gave one short blast from its horn. That sound should have made me feel better. It meant we were leaving. Instead, it made the trees feel closer. I was climbing the steps into the middle escort car when one of our guys said, "Wait." He had the spotlight. He swept it toward the rear of the train one last time. At first, the beam crossed empty gravel and the side of the last freight car. Then it caught something at the far end. Not in the woods this time. Behind the rear escort car. It was standing partly concealed by the metal steps. The same dark hair, the same upright shape, the same stillness. It had followed us out of the trees. For 2 or 3 seconds, it stared down the length of the train at us. Then the locomotive horn sounded again, louder this time. The thing turned and ran. Not on all fours, on 2 legs. It crossed the gravel in a blur and disappeared into the pines. I had never seen anything move that fast in the dark. We got inside and locked the door. Nobody slept on the way back. For a while, everybody talked at once. Then nobody talked at all. When we returned to our base, Barnes told us there would be an incident statement. He said we were to report an unidentified individual near the siding, possibly a trespasser or local civilian. No engagement, no injuries, no loss of cargo. Mercer objected. Barnes looked at him and said, "Do you want to be the officer who files a report about Bigfoot watching an ammunition train?" That ended the discussion. Officially, it became nothing. A trespasser, a nervous lieutenant, poor visibility, a rural misunderstanding. But I know what I saw. I know what Mercer saw. I know what the receiving team already knew before we told them. And I know one more thing. A week later, one of the guys from the rear escort team showed me a picture on his phone. He had taken it from inside the rear car after the first gunshot. The photo was blurry, mostly darkness, window glare, and the pale stripe of the gravel siding. But near the tree line, half hidden behind a pine, was a tall, black shape, one arm wrapped around the trunk, the head angled toward the train, and beside it, farther back between the trees, were two more shapes, smaller, lower to the ground, watching. The receiving team had been right. It was not alone.
Story 2. The White Caps on Miller's Knob. Location: Eastern Kentucky. Approximate year: 2008. My aunt did not disappear the day she picked mushrooms from the old cemetery. That would have made the story easier to explain. She came home that evening. She cleaned those mushrooms. She fried them in butter with onions. Then she ate them with cornbread and went to bed. The knocking started before midnight. 4 days later, she vanished. And when she came back 13 days after that, she weighed almost nothing. Her eyes had sunk so deep into her face that my mother started crying before Aunt Faye even made it to the porch. The first thing my aunt said was not hello. It was, "Don't let them in after dark." This happened in the fall of 2008, outside a small town in eastern Kentucky that most people would drive through without noticing. My family had lived in that part of the county for generations. The hills were steep, the roads were narrow, and the woods came right up to the backs of the houses. If you walked far enough behind my grandmother's place, you could still find rusted fence wire, old stone foundations, and sunken wagon roads from families who had been gone for 100 years. That land remembers people longer than people remember each other. And at least that is what my grandmother used to say. My aunt's name was Faye Miller. She was my mother's older sister. By the time this happened, she was in her late 60s and lived alone in a white clapboard house about a mile from us. Her husband had died years earlier. Her children had moved away to Lexington, Knoxville, and Cincinnati, and they only came back for Christmas, funerals, or when they needed something signed. Aunt Faye did not seem lonely. She kept chickens, canned vegetables, made blackberry jam, and knew the woods better than most men who claimed to hunt them. She could tell rain was coming by the smell of the creek. She could find ramps in spring, blackberries in July, pawpaws in September, and mushrooms whenever the weather had been right. That fall, the weather had been perfect. 3 days of rain, then 2 warm afternoons, then cold nights that left silver frost on the grass before sunrise. Aunt Faye said it was good mushroom weather. My mother told her to be careful. Aunt Faye waved one hand and said, "I've walked these ridges since before you knew how to tie your shoes." That was the kind of woman she was, stubborn, capable, not foolish, but proud enough to believe that the woods near home could not surprise her anymore. She left on a Tuesday morning with a canvas shoulder bag, a pocket knife, and a 5-gallon plastic bucket. She told her neighbor she would be back before supper. And she was. That is the part everyone forgets when they hear this story. She came back. Not at supper exactly. It was closer to dusk. Her neighbor, Mrs. Langley, saw her truck roll into the driveway just before the porch lights came on. She said Aunt Faye moved slowly when she got out, as if she was tired, but that did not seem unusual. A woman her age could spend a full day in the woods and come home stiff. The next morning my mother called her. Aunt Faye said she was fine. She sounded hoarse, but she blamed it on the cold air. My mother asked if she had found any mushrooms. Aunt Faye said she had. Then she changed the subject. We did not know until later that she had gotten lost that day. We did not know about the clearing. We did not know about the old graves. And we did not know that, by the time my mother called, Aunt Faye had already eaten what she brought home. She told us the full story only after she came back 13 days later. Aunt Faye had gone into the woods behind her house, following a ridge she knew well. She had planned to check a place near the old spring where oyster mushrooms sometimes grew on dead beech trees, but there had been almost nothing there. She kept walking. That was her first mistake. The second mistake was crossing the dry creek bed below Miller's Knob. My grandfather used to say not to cross that creek unless you had a reason. The woods were older on the far side. The trees grew closer together. The ground dipped and rose in strange ways. Old paths vanished there. Aunt Faye had heard those warnings all her life, but she was not afraid of local stories. She crossed anyway. The deeper she walked, the better the mushroom hunting became. She found small patches first, then larger ones. Then, near the top of a low rise, she saw a clearing she did not remember. The clearing was almost perfectly round. No large trees grew in the center. Only tall grass, moss, and several raised humps in the ground. At first, Aunt Faye thought they were old root mounds from fallen trees. Then she saw the mushrooms. They were white. Not dull white, but pale and clean-looking, almost bright against the grass. They grew in thick clusters across the little humps, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. She said she had never seen anything like it. Some were as wide as her palm. Some were still small and tight. They smelled fresh, earthy, and sweet. Aunt Faye knew mushrooms. She would never pick something she could not identify. She said they looked like oyster mushrooms at first, though later she admitted they should not have been growing from bare ground. That was the detail she ignored, because the bucket filled quickly. That was the trouble with finding too much of something you want. It makes you stop asking why it was there. She cut the mushrooms carefully and laid them in her bucket. She filled it to the top. Then she filled the canvas bag too. By the time she finished, the sun had moved behind the trees. She turned to leave and realized she did not know which direction she had come from. That was impossible. Aunt Faye knew those woods. She picked one direction and walked. After 20 minutes, she found herself back in the same clearing. She tried another direction. Same result. The round clearing. The humps in the grass. The white mushrooms she had already cut. She said the place felt different the second time. Not darker, not colder, just aware. As if something under the ground had woken up and noticed her standing there with a bucket in her hand. She left the bucket behind and walked faster, but she did not leave all the mushrooms. Her canvas bag was still full. This time, she reached a narrow deer path. She followed it downhill and came out near a county road she did not recognize. A man in an old pickup stopped and asked if she needed a ride. She told him the nearest town. He looked confused. "That's 20 miles from here," he said. Aunt Faye thought he was joking. He was not. The man dropped her at a gas station near a different town, and from there she called a cousin to take her back to her truck. She was embarrassed more than frightened. She told nobody about getting turned around. She told nobody about the clearing, and by the time she got home, she had convinced herself that the mushrooms were still good. That evening, she cleaned them. She fried them in butter with onions. She ate them with cornbread. Then she went to bed. The dream came before midnight. In the dream, she was standing in the same clearing, but the grass had been cut short. People stood all around her, women in black dresses, men in dark coats, children with pale faces and bare feet. Nobody looked directly at her. They all stared toward the center of the clearing. A coffin rested there on 2 wooden boards. Beside it stood a preacher with an old black Bible in his hands. His voice was low and steady, but Aunt Faye could not understand a single word he said. She tried to move away, but the people stood too close. Then the preacher stopped reading. Every head turned toward her. Every face in the clearing looked at the mushrooms in her hands. That was when she realized what the humps had been. They were graves, old graves, so old the markers were gone, so old the cemetery had been swallowed by the woods. The mushrooms had grown from the dead. Aunt Faye woke up screaming. From that night on, she began to weaken. At first it seemed like food poisoning. Then the fever came. Then the sounds. She heard footsteps on the porch after sunset. Slow ones, dragging ones. She heard tapping on the kitchen window, though no branches grew near that side of the house. She heard someone sigh beside her bed. Not in the room, not outside the room, beside her. Once, while she was washing dishes, she saw a reflection in the dark kitchen window. A woman stood behind her. The woman wore a black dress and had wet dirt on her hands. Aunt Faye turned around. No one was there. The next evening, something scratched at the back door. She thought it was a raccoon. Then it spoke. Not loudly. Just enough for her to hear through the wood. "You took from us." Aunt Faye did not open the door. After that, she stopped sleeping. She stopped eating. She said the house smelled like damp soil no matter how many windows she opened during the day. By the 4th night, she saw faces outside the glass, not full faces, just pale shapes where faces should be, standing beyond the porch light, watching. That was when she left. She did not tell anyone where she was going because she did not want to bring those things to another house. Before dawn, she got into her truck and drove east. She would later say she did not remember every road she took. She remembered only the fear that if she looked in the rearview mirror for too long, she would see someone sitting in the back seat. She drove across 2 counties to see an old woman named Miss Adeline Porter. People called Adeline a healer, though never to her face. Some said she was a root worker. Some said she knew old mountain prayers. Some said her grandmother had learned from Cherokee women, and other people said that was just a story white families told when they wanted their superstitions to sound older. I do not know what was true. I only know that when Aunt Faye stepped into that woman's house, Adeline began shouting before my aunt said a single word. "Don't bring them past my kitchen," she said. Aunt Faye froze in the doorway. Adeline pointed at the floor. "You stand right there." Then she looked past my aunt into the empty porch behind her. "How many did you let follow you?" Aunt Faye started crying. Back home, we did not know any of this. We only knew that Aunt Faye had stopped answering the phone. On Saturday morning, my mother drove to her house and found the front door locked. The curtains were closed in every window. The chickens had not been fed. Her truck was gone. That last detail made everyone hesitate. If the truck had been there, the search would have started in the woods immediately. But with the truck missing, nobody knew whether she had left by choice, gone to see one of her children, gotten sick on the road, or driven into a ditch somewhere in the hills. My mother called her children. None of them had heard from her. My uncle called the hospitals in 3 counties. Nothing. By that afternoon, the sheriff had been notified. By evening, men were walking the roads and checking the ravines. The next morning, hunters searched the ridges behind her house anyway, because no one could shake the feeling that the woods were involved. They found nothing. No bucket, no canvas bag, no coat, no fresh tracks that meant anything. The woods were thick that year, and the leaves had already started to fall. Every ravine looked the same. Every slope was covered in brown oak leaves, green moss, and fallen branches. After the 5th day, the search became quieter. After the 8th day, people started speaking in lowered voices. After the 10th day, my mother stopped sleeping. Then, on the 13th evening after she vanished, Aunt Faye walked up our driveway. I was in the kitchen when I heard my mother scream. Not a fear scream, a grief scream. The kind people make when they see someone they thought they had already lost. I ran outside. Aunt Faye was standing near the mailbox, holding on to the post with one hand. Her clothes were filthy. Her jeans were torn at the knees. Her gray sweater was stiff with mud. One shoe was missing. Her hair had leaves tangled through it. And her face. I have never forgotten her face. She looked as if she had been awake the entire time she was gone. Her lips were cracked. Her cheeks had collapsed. Her eyes were open too wide, as if she was still seeing something the rest of us could not. My mother ran to her and tried to hug her. Aunt Faye flinched so hard she almost fell. "Don't," she whispered. "Faye, where have you been?" Aunt Faye looked past my mother toward the house. "Are the curtains closed?" My mother stared at her. "What?" "The curtains," Aunt Faye said. "Close them before dark." We brought her inside. She did not want to sit near any window. She did not want the front door left open. She would not drink from a glass until my mother prayed over it. When my uncle asked where she had been, she shook her head and said she had only gone to get well. That made no sense. Aunt Faye was not well. She was dehydrated, shaking, and so weak that my mother had to help her lift a spoon to her mouth. We wanted to take her to the hospital. She refused. Not argued, refused. She said if we took her away from the house that night, they would follow the road. Nobody knew what she meant. For 2 days, she barely spoke. She slept in my grandmother's old room with the Bible open beside the bed. Every time the house settled, she woke up. Every time a branch touched the siding, she whispered the same words. "I'm sorry." On the 3rd night after her return, my mother finally got the rest of the story out of her. Adeline had told Aunt Faye that she had walked over a burial ground and taken what did not belong to her. Not flowers, not stones, not bones. Food. That was worse, Adeline said, because in old places, food growing from grave ground is not always food. Sometimes it is an invitation. Sometimes it is a debt. Sometimes it is bait. Aunt Faye stayed with Adeline for almost 2 weeks. That was where she had been while everyone searched for her. Adeline would not let her call home. She said names travel. She said worry opens doors. She said if Aunt Faye told us where she was before the work was finished, the dead would know where else they were welcome. I do not know everything Adeline did. Aunt Faye would only tell pieces of it. She said Adeline prayed over her every morning and every night. She burned cedar and tobacco in an iron pan. She poured melted beeswax into cold water and showed Aunt Faye the shapes that formed. The first night, the wax made little round mounds. The second night, it made something like hands. The 5th night, it made faces. After that, Aunt Fay refused to look. Adeline made her drink bitter tea from roots and bark. She washed her hands in salt water. She cut a small piece from the hem of Aunt Fay's sweater and burned it outside before sunrise. On the 10th night, Aunt Fay woke to the sound of singing. Not Adeline, not from inside the house. The singing came from the yard, low voices, many of them. She looked toward the window, but Adeline slapped her hand over Aunt Fay's eyes. "Don't count them," she whispered. "Why?" "Because if you know how many came, you'll know how many are still missing." On the 13th morning, Adeline said it was finished. Not forgiven. Finished. There is a difference. She drove Aunt Fay back toward our side of the county, but stopped half a mile from our house. Aunt Fay's truck stayed behind Adeline's barn. We would not know that until later, when one of Adeline's nephews brought it back without a word and left the keys in our mailbox. Before letting Aunt Fay out of the car, Adeline gave her 3 instructions. Do not pick mushrooms beyond the creek. Do not answer any knock after dark unless you know the living person on the other side, and never go looking for the clearing again. If they let you leave once, Adeline said, don't make them decide twice. That was the story Aunt Fay told us. My mother wanted to believe it was sickness, dehydration, fear, and an old woman filling her head with mountain nonsense. My uncle wanted to believe it was some kind of mushroom poisoning. I wanted to believe both of them, but that night, after Aunt Fay finished talking, we heard 3 taps on the kitchen window. Tap, tap, tap. Everyone went still. The kitchen window faced the side yard. There was no porch on that side, no tree close enough for a branch to touch the glass. My uncle stood and pulled the curtain aside. Nobody was there, but on the outside of the window, in the yellow light from the kitchen, we could see 3 muddy fingerprints sliding slowly down the glass. Aunt Fay began to cry. My mother closed every curtain in the house. The next morning, my uncle drove to Aunt Fay's place to check on the chickens and clean out her refrigerator. He came back with the canvas shoulder bag. He had found it hanging from the inside knob of her back door. None of us had seen it when she came to our house. It was damp. It smelled like wet leaves and old soil. Inside were 3 white mushrooms, fresh, clean, unbruised, as if they had been picked that morning. My uncle took the bag outside and burned it in a metal barrel. The smoke turned thick and gray. For a few seconds it smelled exactly like damp earth being dug open after rain. After that, Aunt Fay changed. She recovered physically, but she was never the same woman again. She stopped going into the woods. She stopped canning mushrooms. She would not even eat store-bought ones from a grocery shelf. Every evening before sunset, she checked the curtains. Every night she placed a Bible on the windowsill beside her bed, and every fall, when the weather turned warm after rain and cold after dark, she would call my mother and say the same thing. Tell the kids not to cross the creek. For years, I thought the worst part of the story was that old cemetery, the forgotten graves, the mushrooms, the things that followed her home. But I was wrong. The worst part came much later. After Aunt Fay died in 2019, we had to clean out her house. In the back of her bedroom closet, behind a stack of quilts, I found a shoebox tied shut with twine. Inside were old family papers, insurance documents, a few photographs, and a folded hand-drawn map. It showed the ridge behind her house, the dry creek bed, Miller's Knob, and beyond it, in pencil, a small circle marked in the woods. Beside the circle, Aunt Fay had written 4 words. They moved the graves. I asked my mother what that meant. She told me there had once been a church settlement on the far side of Miller's Knob. It burned sometime in the late 1800s. Later, when the county road was cut through, some of the cemetery stones were moved closer to town. The stones were moved, not the bodies. Nobody wanted to spend money digging up poor mountain people who had no living descendants left to complain. So the markers went one place, the dead stayed another. That explained the clearing. It did not explain the last thing in the box. Under the map was a small paper envelope. Inside were 3 dried white mushrooms pressed flat with age, and wrapped around them was a strip of black cloth that smelled faintly of smoke, cedar, and grave dirt. I threw the whole thing into the burn barrel. The mushrooms would not catch at first. Even after the paper burned, they sat there in the flames, blackening around the edges but holding their shape. Then one of them split open. For 1 second, I heard a sound come from inside the barrel. A breath, long, wet, human. I have not gone past the creek since, into that wood full of secrets.
Story 3, The Thing That Made the Wolves Kneel. Location, Western Montana. Approximate year, 2004. My uncle used to say fear was nothing but a bad habit. He said a man could stop being afraid the same way he could stop laughing at a joke that was not funny. Just close your mouth, stand still, and decide. That was what he believed for most of his life. Then something found him in the Montana timber. After that night, he never said those words again. My uncle's name was Wyatt Rusk. He was my mother's older brother, although nobody in the family called him Uncle Wyatt. To most of us, he was just Wyatt. By the time I was old enough to understand the stories people told about him, Wyatt was already a legend in our family. He was not famous. He was not rich. He had never been on television, never written a book, never done anything that would make strangers know his name. But in the places where he lived, men remembered him. Wyatt was built like something made for an older century, 6'6", wide shoulders, hands so large that a coffee mug disappeared inside them. He had a square jaw, a flattened nose from a rodeo accident, and pale gray eyes that made people look away before they understood why. When I was a kid, I thought he looked like a carved wooden statue that had learned to breathe. He was not loud. That was what made him different from other big men. He did not threaten people. He did not brag. He did not pick fights in bars or tell everyone how dangerous he was. He just existed with the quiet confidence of a man who had never found a reason to step backward. There were stories about him long before the one I am about to tell. My mother said that once, in his 20s, Wyatt was riding a Greyhound bus through Idaho when 2 drunk men tried to start a fight with the driver. Everyone on the bus went quiet. The men were cursing, kicking the partition, and one of them had a knife clipped inside his jacket. Wyatt stood up from the back row, walked down the aisle, and did not say a word. He simply stopped beside them. The first man looked up at him, then the second man looked up. A few seconds later, both of them sat down. At the next station, they got off without being asked. Another time, 3 men broke into Wyatt's trailer outside Missoula because someone told them he kept cash from a truck sale in a coffee can under the kitchen sink. Wyatt heard the latch lift. He got out of bed, walked into the kitchen in nothing but boxer shorts, and turned on the light. The 3 men were already inside. One had a pry bar, one had a revolver, one was halfway through opening a drawer. Wyatt stood in the hallway and looked at them. That was all. He looked at them. The man with the revolver lowered it first. Then all 3 of them ran for the back doors so fast that one crashed through the screen instead of opening it. Wyatt never called the sheriff. He just fixed the door the next morning. When my cousin asked why he had not been afraid, Wyatt said the sentence everyone in the family would repeat for years. Fear is just an emotion, same as sadness, same as joy. You don't have to obey it. I heard that line so many times growing up that I believed it had always been true, and maybe for Wyatt, it had been. He had worked oil fields in North Dakota, logging crews in Idaho, ranches in Wyoming, and road construction in places where a man could get hurt badly enough to disappear from a payroll without anyone asking too many questions. He had been kicked by horses, thrown from bulls, cut with a chainsaw, bitten by a dog, rolled a pickup down a ravine and walked 3 miles with 2 cracked ribs. None of those things changed him. The woods did. Wyatt loved the woods in a way that never looked romantic from the outside. He was not the kind of man who talked about nature being beautiful or healing. He hunted, he trapped, he cut firewood, he slept under canvas in weather that would send other men back to town. He could disappear into the mountains for 3 days with a rifle, a bedroll, coffee, jerky, and a dented tin cup, then come back smelling like smoke and snow with an elk quarter over his shoulder. I do not know how he found his way. I never saw him use a GPS. I rarely saw him use a compass. He seemed to carry a map inside his head. Creeks, ridgelines, old burns, game trails, broken snags, rock slides. He remembered everything. He knew which valleys held mule deer after the first snow. He knew where elk crossed when hunters pushed them out of public land. He knew how to sleep in a storm without getting wet. He knew where bears denned, where wolves ran, and where not to step when the ground looked solid but was only moss over rotten deadfall. That is why what happened to him made no sense. Wyatt never told this story in front of the family, not once, at least not to me. I heard it when I was 16 during a family gathering at my grandfather's place near Hamilton, Montana. It was late October. The adults had been outside most of the evening, standing around a burn barrel behind the garage, drinking beer, smoking cigarettes, and telling stories they did not want the younger kids to hear. I was old enough to be ignored, but young enough that nobody thought I was listening. Wyatt was not there. That mattered. If he had been, nobody would have spoken about it. My mother's cousin Ray was the one who brought it up. Ray had hunted with Wyatt more than anyone else, and although he liked to exaggerate, nobody accused him of lying when it came to this story. Before he started, Ray looked toward the house to make sure Wyatt was not coming outside. Then he said he had heard the story from Wyatt himself, not around a campfire, not as a joke, not the way men usually tell hunting stories. Wyatt had told him on the 3rd day after it happened, sitting in his trailer with a bottle on the table, a rifle across his lap, and every light in the place turned on. Ray said it happened in 2004, somewhere north of the Bitterroot Valley, in a stretch of timber he would not name. Wyatt had gone out alone in late November to look for elk. It had been a bad year. Early snow in the high country, warm weather after that, then hard freezes. The animals were moving strangely, and the wolves were hungrier than usual. This was not long after wolves had started coming back strong in that part of Montana. Some people were glad, ranchers were not. Hunters argued about it constantly. Every gas station counter and diner booth had an opinion. Wyatt did not talk politics about wolves. He respected them. That is not the same as liking them. He knew what they were capable of. He knew they could test a man if they were hungry enough. That morning, he drove his old Ford as far as the road allowed, then hiked in before daylight. He carried a .30-06 rifle, a revolver on his belt, a fixed-blade knife, 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and a small thermos of coffee. The snow was ankle-deep in open places and almost gone beneath thick pine. By mid-morning, he found fresh elk sign, droppings not frozen yet, tracks cutting across a slope, broken brush where a small group had passed through in the night. He followed them for hours. The country was rough. Dark timber, steep draws, fallen lodgepole, and patches of old burn where black trunks stood like fence posts against the snow. By late afternoon, he realized the elk had moved farther than expected. He also realized he had not heard another shot all day. No trucks, no voices, no distant engines, nothing. Just wind in the trees and the occasional cracking sound of frozen branches shifting under their own weight. That did not bother him. Wyatt preferred empty country. He ate one sandwich while standing beside a fallen log, drank coffee from the thermos, and decided to cut across a lower ridge before turning back. That was when he saw the first wolf. It stood between two pines about 80 yards below him, gray coat, narrow chest, head low, watching. Wyatt stopped. The wolf did not run. That was unusual, but not impossible. He shifted his rifle in both hands and looked around. Then he saw the second wolf, then the third, then two more behind him. They had not surrounded him completely yet, but they were working on it. Wyatt told Ray later that the first thought in his head was not fear, it was irritation. He knew what the animals were doing. They were not charging. They were not acting rabid. They were testing him. A hungry pack will sometimes do that. One moves where you can see it, another circles, another comes in from behind. They wait to see what you are, a threat, a meal, or something that can be turned into one. Wyatt lifted the rifle and fired one shot into the air. The sound cracked across the valley and rolled off the trees. The wolves did not scatter, they flinched. One lowered itself closer to the ground, another showed its teeth, but none of them ran. That was when Wyatt knew this was not normal. He chambered another round. He backed toward a large pine, close enough that he could feel bark behind one shoulder when he shifted his weight. It helped, but not enough. The tree did not truly cover his back, not in that uneven timber. The slope curved behind him, and there were gaps between the trunks wide enough for anything to move through. Wyatt kept that pine behind him, or thought he did. Below him, the slope opened in patches, and he could see movement between the trunks. More gray shapes slipped through the timber. 6 wolves, maybe 7, maybe more he could not see. The light was getting bad, that thin blue light that comes before evening in the mountains, when snow still glows but the woods turn black between the trees. Wyatt shouted at them, his voice carried. The wolves did not care. One came closer, then another. He picked the nearest one and put the front sight behind its shoulder. He did not want to shoot it, not because he was sentimental, because one shot would start the rest moving, and if he missed or wounded one without killing it, the situation would get worse very quickly. But when the nearest wolf took another step toward him, Wyatt decided he was done waiting. He tightened his finger on the trigger, and then every wolf stopped, not one or two, all of them, at the same time. Wyatt told Ray that it was so sudden it felt like someone had snapped a wire through the woods. The nearest wolf froze with one paw lifted. Another had been moving sideways and locked in place mid-step. The one below the pines stopped showing its teeth. Their ears went flat, then their heads turned, not toward Wyatt, past him, toward the timber behind his right shoulder. Wyatt did not turn around immediately. That was the first time in his life, Ray said, that he heard Wyatt admit he did not want to know what was at his back. The wolves began to tremble, not the way animals tremble from cold. This was deeper than that. It looked as if something had taken hold of them from the inside. Their legs shook so hard that the crusted snow around their paws cracked, slumped, and left ragged little marks where they stood. One of the younger wolves dropped low to the ground, belly pressed flat, head down between its front paws. Another collapsed onto its side as if the bones had gone out of it. Then 2 wolves came toward Wyatt. He almost shot them. But they were not attacking. They crawled to him, crawled. These were wild animals, hungry predators, and they dragged themselves across the snow until they reached his boots. They were not coming to him because they trusted him. They were coming because he was the only solid living thing between them and whatever had stepped out of the trees. One pressed its body against his left leg and whined like a beaten dog. The other pressed its muzzle into the snow beside his right boot and tucked its head between its front paws. That was when Wyatt turned. He said the air behind him looked wrong before he saw the shape. The trees were still there, the snow was still there. But the space between them seemed stretched, darkened, as if a piece of night had been pulled loose and hung upright among the pines. Then it stepped forward. At first, Wyatt thought it was smoke. Not smoke from a fire, smoke with weight, smoke that knew where it wanted to go. It was tall, taller than him, maybe 7 feet, maybe more. The shape had shoulders, a torso, and arms that hung almost to the knees, but it was not built like a person. Its outline kept shifting, ragged at the edges, like torn cloth moving in a wind that Wyatt could not feel. The body looked both solid and hollow. In some places he could see the pale snow through it. In others it was black enough to swallow the trunks behind it. The head was the worst part. Ray had to stop when he described it. He said Wyatt called it a head shaped like a drop of tar hanging upside down. Wide at the top, narrowing toward the chin, too large for the body, no eyes that he could see, no mouth, no face, but it looked at him. Wyatt knew it looked at him. The wolves knew it too. The whole pack was on the ground now. Some were pressed flat in the snow, some had rolled onto their sides, one had urinated on itself. The two against Wyatt's legs would not move. One kept making a thin, high sound through its teeth. The kind of sound an animal makes when it has already accepted that it is going to die. Wyatt had faced men with knives. He had faced bulls in chutes. He had faced weather, pain, broken bones, wild dogs, drunk loggers, and the kind of loneliness that makes some men talk to themselves after 3 nights alone in the backcountry. None of it had prepared him for standing in front of something that made wolves crawl to a man for shelter. The shape did not rush him. It did not growl. It did not raise its arms. It simply stood there. Wyatt stood there too. He still had the rifle in his hands. He could have fired. He did not. He later told Ray there was no point, not because he thought the bullet would miss, because some part of him understood that shooting it would be like shooting a shadow cast by a mountain. You might disturb the air. You would not hurt what made it. For a long time, nothing moved. The woods had gone silent in a way Wyatt had never heard before. No wind, no birds, no distant branch cracks. Even the wolves had stopped whining. Wyatt could hear only his own breathing. Then he heard something else. A low sound. Not from the creature. From inside his own head. Not words exactly. More like the shape of a thought being pressed into him. Small, that was the feeling. Not you are going to die, not run, not look away, just small. For the first time in his life, Wyatt Rusk understood that courage and size had nothing to do with each other. He understood that a man could be 6'6", strong enough to drag an elk quarter through deadfall, stubborn enough to stare down armed men, and still be nothing more than a warm piece of meat standing in the snow. The shape leaned closer. It did not step. It leaned. The ragged edges of its body moved like strips of wet black cloth. The air smelled suddenly of cold ashes, old water, and something sweet gone rotten under leaves. Wyatt's hands went numb. He tried to say something, a prayer, a curse, a threat. He could not make his mouth work. The creature tilted its enormous head. For 1 second, Wyatt thought he saw something inside the blackness where its face should have been. Not eyes, not teeth, a depth. As if the inside of that head did not end. Then the shape turned away, just like that. It turned toward the timber and moved between the trees. The wolves did not move until it was gone. Even then, they waited. 1 minute, 2, maybe 5. Wyatt never knew. Finally, the wolf against his right boot lifted its head. It looked up at him. He said there was no wildness in its eyes then, only terror. Then it ran. The others followed, not in formation, not like a hunting pack. They scattered in every direction, crashing through brush and snow, falling over themselves in their need to get away from that place. Wyatt remained beside the pine until full dark. Not because he felt safe there, because he could not make himself turn his back on the place where the shape had disappeared. He waited for the woods to become woods again, for the wind to move, for a branch to crack, for anything living to make a sound. When a crow finally called somewhere far below the ridge, Wyatt nearly fell to his knees. He did not remember deciding to move. He remembered looking down and realizing his rifle was still aimed at the ground. He remembered his finger hurt from how tightly it had locked around the trigger guard. He remembered that his legs felt like they belonged to someone else. Somehow he walked out. He did not follow his own tracks. He did not use the route he had taken in. He moved downhill until he found a creek, then followed it by sound through the dark. Only when he reached the creek did he realize his hat was gone. He stopped and almost turned back. Then he looked up the dark slope behind him. The timber was silent. Too silent. He left the hat where it was. A little farther down the creek, he dropped one glove while climbing over a fallen log and did not stop for that either. At some point, he crossed a barbed wire fence and cut his hand badly enough that blood froze on his knuckles. He reached his truck sometime after 2 in the morning. The dome light came on when he opened the door and he nearly screamed. That was the detail that made Ray stop talking when he first told us the story. Wyatt nearly screamed at his own truck light. He drove home without turning on the radio. He left the rifle in the passenger seat. When he pulled into his driveway, his wife, my Aunt Linda, was already awake. She had been worried for hours. She came onto the porch in her robe. Wyatt got out of the truck and looked at the tree line behind the trailer. Linda asked him what happened. He did not answer. She asked whether he was hurt. He looked down at his bloody hand as if he had not noticed it. Then he said, "Don't let the dogs out tonight." That was all. For the next 3 days, Wyatt drank. That part was not like him. He had never been a drunk. He could have a beer like any other man, maybe whiskey on a holiday, but he was not the type to disappear into a bottle. After that night, he did. He sat in the trailer with the curtain shut, the lights on, and his rifle close enough to touch. He did not sleep in the bedroom. He dragged his recliner into the front room and turned it toward the door. A bottle sat on the little table beside him, then another, then another. Linda tried to get him to eat. He would not. She tried to get him to talk. He would not. Every time something tapped against the roof or clicked in the walls, Wyatt lifted his head like a man listening for footsteps. Outside, the weather did not change. That was one of the things people remembered later. No new snow fell for those 3 days. The old snow hardened into a crust. By afternoon, it shone like dull glass. By night, it held every mark pressed into it. The moon was full that week, clean and bright, and there were no clouds to cover it. The light was so strong that even the brush behind Wyatt's trailer cast thin black shadows on the snow. The timber around the property stood in a hard silver glow, and the silence was wrong. Not peaceful, not winter quiet, wrong. Coyotes did not call. Owls did not answer from the trees. Even the dogs from the neighboring places, dogs that usually barked at every deer, truck, and passing shadow, did not howl once, not under a full moon, not for 3 nights. By the 3rd day, Linda could not take it anymore. She called Ray. Ray drove out that evening. He found Wyatt in the recliner, unshaven, red-eyed, still wearing the same flannel shirt he had worn when he came back from the mountain. The rifle was across his lap. The bottle beside him was almost empty. Ray said the trailer smelled like whiskey, gun oil, and wet wool. Linda stepped outside when Ray asked her to. Ray sat across from Wyatt and did not speak for a while. That was the right thing to do. With a man like Wyatt, questions could shut a door. Silence sometimes opened it. Finally, Ray said, "What happened up there?" Wyatt stared at the floor for a long time. Then he started talking. Not fast, not dramatically. He told it like a man reading from something burned into the back of his eyes. The wolves, the pine, the way they stopped, the thing in the timber, the thought inside his head. Small. Ray listened until the bottle was empty and the moon had moved from one window to the next. Before dawn, Wyatt made Ray swear not to repeat it while he was alive. Ray swore. Then Wyatt said one more thing. "If you go up there, don't call my name." Ray asked why. Wyatt looked at him for the first time that night. "Because I don't know what hurt it." The next morning, Ray went anyway. He later said he had two reasons. The first was that he did not believe any patch of timber could scare Wyatt Rusk badly enough to break him. The second was that he needed to know whether the story had happened in the world or only inside Wyatt's head. So he drove to the old parking spot just after sunrise. The sky was clear. The cold had sharpened overnight. The snow under his boots did not sink. It cracked. Every step sounded too loud. Ray found the creek and followed it uphill, the same way Wyatt had said he came down in the dark. The woods were bright in a way that made no sense. Even under the pines, the snow seemed to hold moonlight from the night before. There were no fresh flakes to soften anything. No wind had smoothed the surface. No thaw had washed the tracks away. Whatever had happened up there had been pressed into the crust and left there. Ray found Wyatt's trail first, not the whole trail, pieces of it. A boot heel cut into snow beside the creek, a place where a man had slipped and caught himself against a root, a smear of old blood on the top strand of a barbed wire fence, a single glove frozen stiff beneath a fallen log. Ray picked it up, then dropped it almost immediately. He never said why. Farther uphill, the creek bent left, the timber thickened, and then Ray found the clearing. He did not find the exact pine at first. He found the wolves. Their tracks were everywhere, not wandering, not crossing through like animals traveling, circling, testing, closing. The marks ran in broken rings around the place where Wyatt must have stood. Some tracks were deep, punched hard through the crust. Others were scraped sideways as if the animals had stopped too suddenly. Ray saw where one wolf had frozen with its front paw lifted and set it down again almost in the same place. He saw claw marks where another had scrambled without moving forward. Then he saw the low trails, belly marks, 2 of them. They started near the outer ring of tracks and dragged toward the center, not walking, not running, crawling. The snow was scraped flat where their bodies had slid over it. Those 2 trails ended beside a pair of boot prints, Wyatt's boot prints. Ray said he stood there for a long time before he made himself look at the rest. Around the center of the clearing, the snow had been pressed down into several deep shapes, not paw prints, not boot prints, bodies, as if wolves had lain flat around something or bowed to it. Some of the body marks were so clear that Ray could see where ribs had pushed into the crust. One wolf had left the shape of its head between its front legs. Another had rolled onto its side and kicked one back foot deep enough to expose old pine needles beneath the snow. Then Ray saw the place behind Wyatt's right shoulder, the place where the thing should have stepped out. There were no tracks there, no footprints, no drag marks, no animal trail, nothing that showed anything had walked into the clearing. But the snow between 2 pines had changed. It had not melted. It had not been crushed. It had simply gone dark. A long, narrow stain in the crust, like soot trapped under ice. Ray did not touch it. He said that while he was looking at it, the woods went quiet. No birds, no wind, no creek sound. Then, somewhere behind him, a branch snapped. Ray did not turn around. He walked out as fast as he could without running. He took Wyatt's glove with him, but he never gave it back. He said he burned it in a barrel behind his house that night. He never told Wyatt he had gone up there, not then, not later. After that, Wyatt changed. He was still big, still strong, still quiet. But the old certainty was gone. He no longer said fear was just an emotion. He no longer mocked people for being afraid of storms, dark roads, empty houses, or strange noises in the woods. That winter, he sold most of his hunting gear, not all at once. That would have made people ask too many questions. First the tree stand, then his trapping supplies, then 2 rifles, then his pack frame. When Ray asked if he wanted to hunt the next elk season, Wyatt said no. Ray thought he was joking. Wyatt did not smile. No, he said again. After that, nobody asked. The strangest part came the following spring. A rancher named Tom Dillard owned land near where Wyatt had parked his truck that night. He called Wyatt because he found something near one of his fence lines and thought maybe Wyatt had left it. It was Wyatt's hat, the one he had lost on the mountain. but it was not on the mountain anymore. It was hanging from the top strand of barbed wire less than 50 yards from where Wyatt had parked. Clean, dry, no chew marks, no weather damage, as if someone had placed it there that morning. Wyatt drove out to get it. Ray went with him. The moment they reached the fence, Wyatt stopped walking. Ray said his face changed, not fear exactly, recognition. The hat was hanging crown down from the wire. Inside it was a small bundle of gray hair, wolf hair, wrapped around a strip of blackened bark. Ray told him not to touch it. Wyatt did not answer. He took the hat down using a stick, carried it to the gravel road, and burned it with gasoline from the truck. The hair burned first. The bark did not. It sat in the fire for several minutes, black already, refusing to change. Then it split with a sound like a knuckle cracking. Wyatt stepped back so quickly that he almost fell. Ray said something moved in the trees across the road. He could not say what. Only that the shadows between two pines seemed to pull away from the trunks and then settle back into place. Wyatt got in the truck and told Ray to drive. He never returned to that drainage again. Years passed. People stopped bringing up the story around him, but the change in Wyatt never fully left. Once when I was 19, I asked him whether the story was true. We were alone in his garage. He was sharpening a hatchet at the workbench. The radio was playing low in the corner and rain tapped against the metal roof. I expected him to tell me Ray had exaggerated. I expected him to say wolves were dangerous, shadows played tricks, and men around burn barrels turned every bad night into a ghost story. Instead, he stopped sharpening. He kept his eyes on the blade. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he asked me, "Do you know what scares a wolf?" I said, "Bigger predators, I guess." He nodded once. Bears, men, other wolves if the pack is wrong. He turned the hatchet in his hands. A wolf understands all that. Teeth, blood, hunger, territory. That's the world it lives in. Then he looked at me. His eyes were still gray, still hard, but there was something behind them I had never seen in any other adult. Not weakness, a memory. What I saw scared them because it didn't belong to their world either. I did not know what to say. He went back to sharpening the blade. I asked him what it wanted. The sound of the file stopped again. Wyatt looked toward the garage window. Outside, the rain made the yard shine black under the porch light. "I don't think it wanted anything," he said. "That's what scared me." He never explained further. Wyatt died in 2018 from a heart attack while changing a tire outside Missoula. At his funeral, people told the old stories. The bus story, the burglars, the rodeo accident, the time he carried a grown man with a broken leg down from a logging slope, the time he stitched his own arm with fishing line because the nearest clinic was closed. Everyone laughed. Everyone remembered him as fearless. Only a few of us knew that was not true. After the burial, Ray pulled me aside near the parking lot. He was older then, thinner. His hand shook when he lit a cigarette. He told me there was one part of the story he had never repeated in front of the family. I asked why. He said because Wyatt had made him promise. Then he told me about the morning he went back, the tracks, the belly marks, the body-shaped depressions in the snow, the dark place between the trees where nothing had left a footprint. And when I asked him why he was telling me now, he looked toward the cemetery, where they had just lowered my uncle into the ground. "Because your uncle wasn't a coward," Ray said. Then he crushed the cigarette beneath his shoe. He was warned. I thought about that for a long time. I still do. I think about it whenever I hear people talk about courage like it is the opposite of fear. It is not. Sometimes fear is information. Sometimes it is the only honest thing your body knows. And sometimes, if every living thing in the forest drops to the ground at once, the smartest thing a man can do is kneel with them.